Hi, it's Jeff at Slavens Racing. This video is about how to tune power valves on KTM 250-300, the Husaberg 250-300, and the new 14 Husqvarna 250 and 300. Those are all the same engines. Doesn't matter what model it is. XC, XCW, SX, 6 days, TE, they're all the same motor. So we're going to talk about a number of things on the power valve setup today, but my primary focus here is the parts that everybody wants to mess with, and that's the preload adjuster down here on the lower part of the case down here. So I would first recommend that you establish, anytime you're going to tune or modify anything, you should establish a baseline. And I've got a previous video out on how to set the Z dimension on the power valve flap, so you should start there. So the power valve flap is inside the cylinder. That's the main power valve flap that goes up and down. You need to know that that's set correctly. If your bike is new, you can assume that it is. So the factory is usually pretty good at getting them set correctly, and if you go to check it a few hundred or 1,000 miles down the road or something, and you find out that it's lower than what they say in the book, that's because the thing is worn in some. You know, it bounces off the adjuster stop, and it's going to lower over time. Not a lot, but you know, maybe a quarter to half a millimeter. So make sure that that flap height is set correctly. From there, there's the linkage arm behind this pipe is a power valve cover, and there's a linkage arm that comes up from the case. It hooks into this down here, and that linkage arm, whenever it is attached to it's a ball and socket, and whenever it's attached to that ball, when you put it on there, it should have just a slight downward pressure. You don't want it to have an upward pressure. You don't want it to just fall on. It needs to have just a slight downward pressure. So I'll make sure those two things are set correctly. You know, I'm trying to tell you here how a professional racing mechanic would set the engine up correctly. A guy who's been properly trained on this, like a factory mechanic or some other professional mechanic who really knows these engines. All right, so from there we've got the preload adjuster down here. Now the preload adjuster adjusts the auxiliary and the primary spring that's behind it here. Now I've got some long bolts in here right now, and I'll explain why a little bit later. You know, this would normally be in like this with some shorter bolts. And then you can adjust this with a number of different tools. So we've got the Moto tool. This has to be installed into the cover, and then it stays on there permanently, and it just hangs down when you're not using it. And then if you want to reach down and make an adjustment when you're at the track or the trail or wherever you are, you can do that just by flipping this handle up and turning it. It's a pretty slick little device. We sell those, and we also sell these on SlavensRacing.com. This is an Enduro Engineering adjuster tool that just fits in here, and then you just turn it. You know, it's just a wrench, so you just turn it to adjust that. Now these adjusters do turn hard. They've got a lot of friction on it from that O-ring that's in there, and you know, you got to apply a significant amount of pressure to turn them. So let's go in here and take a look at what we're actually talking about as far as this adjuster springs. So nice, this thing pulled up out there on the diesel. So behind this cover is the main spring, this long, big spring, and then inside of it is an auxiliary spring. You can just take your fingernail and get in there and pull that out. It just attaches to this little cup, and then the spring is attached, just stuck on it, so you just pull it off. And this is the yellow spring, that's the stock spring. And you can see that this is slotted here, and that slot fits on a pin in there. I'll cover that whenever I go to put this back together. And then down here we have the Slavens tuning kit. So it's just a simple kit that we sell with 3 springs in it. And we include the stock yellow spring because For one thing, the springs are cheap. They're only a couple bucks a piece. The kit is very inexpensive. We include that stock yellow spring because if you bought the bike used, you may not know what spring is in there. And so it's always good to have that one to go back to. I prefer the yellow spring on the 300s. On the 250s, I do like the red spring if it's set up correctly, and if it's combined with the SX head and an SX CDI box. So we'll get to that here in a minute. You can see that the red spring is a thinner wire diameter, and then the green spring doesn't look very green, but it's called the green spring. It has a thicker wire diameter. So this is a stiffer spring, this is a softer spring. This will allow the power valve to open sooner, and this will make it open later. So depending on how you've got it adjusted, the red spring will give you more hit off the bottom and make it rev quicker. The medium spring here, the yellow, is the all-around type power band. That's the one I prefer for most use. And then the green is if you're wanting to mellow the bike out and want a real linear power band, wanting to take the hit out of it. So that's kind of your three options there. So kind of the next step on establishing your baseline is after you decide which spring you want and you put it back together, is in your owner's manual. Over here's the owner's manual. There's a setting on this one. It's in the technical data section in the back of the manual. And you can see here that it says beginning of adjustment, 5,600 RPMs. That's when the power valve should start to open. And then this next part is a little confusing. It says end of adjustment with red spring, yellow spring, or green spring. End of adjustment. Well, that doesn't mean a lot to me, but what they're telling you here is that this one will be fully open. With the red spring, it will be fully open at 7,200 RPM. With the yellow spring, it will be fully open. The power valve will be fully open at 7,900, and with the green, the power valve will be fully open at 8,400 RPM. So you can see that the green spring is going to hold that power valve down longer, and that's what gives you that smoother transition. So from there, I'm going to start reassembling this somewhat so you can see how I do my next step of the setup. So the auxiliary spring is stuck onto there, and then I just push this back inside of here and then just push it in all the way. And then I know that that pin is horizontal in there, so I'm going to set this in there horizontally. You can stick a flashlight in there and see the pin. It's very easy. And to make sure that you've got it on there, just try to turn this thing, and it shouldn't turn, you know, maybe a 1/16 of a turn or something. So that tells you it's on there all the way. Then you can put the cover back on. And I put the cover for setting the power valve up. I first start off with bolts that are too long. So here's the stock bolts that hold the cover on, and this is what I'm going to use. This is a 5mm by 20 millimeters long. This is a 5mm by 30 millimeters long, and then they both have got a 0.8 thread pitch. You should be able to get those at a motorcycle shop or at your local Ace Hardware or someplace like that. I just scrounged these up. The two I'm going to use don't even have the same heads on them. That's totally irrelevant. And I stick these in. And I actually think that this job is easier with the bike laying on its left side, this part of the job. And I just pick my skid plate part way off. It's best if you take them completely off because it's still kind of in my way here. So I'm not going to tighten these down. I'm going to snug them down until they just barely contact that case. And that's why it's best to do it on its side, because you can just have the gravity pulling that cover down, and so you know exactly where zero is. So it's just sitting there at zero, you know, with no preload, not a negative or a positive preload. So the way I'm doing it here is a little bit trickier because you've got to kind of make a judgment call when you've got it exactly right. I think it's still a little too floppy on there, but I'm not going to get carried away with trying to get that exactly set at zero right at the moment. And then I want to measure this gap. And So I'm going to use calipers. And make sure you've got those zeroed. And I'm going to use this part of the caliper, not these jaws. I'm going to use these jaws. And getting in right here is a little bit tricky because the caliper wants to bang off the case right here. So you can get a better measurement going in this way. And I'm just going to measure that gap. And then I'm going to lock that down. And I'm going to take a look. And it's set at 12.98. 13 is kind of the magic number for me on these settings. So 13 millimeters, what does that really mean? That means that when I tighten this cover down, since I've got a 13 millimeter gap with no preload right there, when I tighten that cover down, I've got 13 millimeters of preload on the springs. So now I've established a baseline. So from there I can put the short bolts back in, tighten the thing down, and I've got a starting point, the baseline. I also like to take a magic marker and always put a little mark on this cover and a little mark on the brass piece so I can tell how much I'm turning it. Other guys like to turn it a bunch at once. I don't do that. Guys all the time call me up, oh man, I turned that thing in 3 turns or out 3 turns and now it does this or that. And I don't ever turn them 3 turns. Quarter turn at a time, half a turn. I do it in very small increments. So from there we need to establish that the power valve is opening as the manual suggested, starting at 5,600 RPM. So I use a tachometer for that. You know, the bike obviously didn't come with a tachometer, but we sell these slick little tachs for 35 bucks. These are by Tech. It's a tach and an hour gauge, so it's got a dual purpose to it. These are very easy to mount. I've got a video made on this I haven't posted yet. They mount up on the steering head of the frame, and you know, they're inexpensive. They don't take up any space. They're not heavy, and they're easy to install. And that way, you'll have a tachometer for setting up your power valve if you decide you want to go to that extent. So I would tighten this down, and then I would start the bike up, and I would pull the power valve cover off here behind the pipe, and I would watch the power valve to see when it opens, so what RPM it starts to open. You can see that when it starts to move the linkage. And you're going to want that set at 5,600 or possibly lower. I wouldn't set it higher. Some guys do, but I don't. If I was going to go any direction, I would go down. I would go 55 or 5,400 RPM. Reason being is if there's not enough preload, especially when you're running that red spring, mainly when you're running that red spring, if there's not enough preload here on that spring or the springs, then the thing will have an undesirable power characteristic, and that is you can get it out on a flat field. You know, so you got a field behind your house, and you put that red spring in there, and you go rip around, and you back that adjuster way out, and you go, man, this thing hits hard and revs quick, and that's what I want. Well, then you get it in a load situation where you're climbing a steep hill, and when you go to upshift that thing, you know, it won't pull out of that next gear. It just falls flat on its face. Or you get it in a big mud section where you really need some grunt, and it falls on its face. It doesn't even want to pull out of it. It wants to stay at a single RPM, just lug along. You know, that's because there's not enough preload on there, and that power valve flap is in there trying to figure out what to do, and it's bouncing around some. So that's what happens if when you back these out too much. Or that's what can happen, primarily with that red spring. So after I've used the tack and set this at the RPM level that I want for the starting point, 5,600 RPM, from there I've got a very well-established baseline. All the different components are set correctly, and now I've got a point to which I can modify. I can go one way or the other and decide what I like best, or what works best with a certain pipe, or a certain jetting combination, or a certain head mod. I'm always trying to build things that are very well-rounded, that work with a lot of products under a lot of different conditions. I don't like really job-specific tuning. I mean, that doesn't work for most of us because we don't ride at the exact same place every single time. So once all those different things are established, then you can use your adjuster, your Kraft Moto adjuster, or your tool, your Enduro Engineering tool, and you can turn this thing in or out. I highly recommend that you write down how many turns you're doing it, so in case you want to go back to the starting point. And I also recommend you do it in small increments. I mean, sometimes just a quarter or a half a turn can make a big difference on throttle response right off of idle, and it can really help kind of clean up the jetting. So I think that pretty well covers power valves for now. If you have any further questions about power valves settings, you're welcome to email me, jeff@slavensracing.com. Please make them short, sweet, and concise. I do not like emails where people like to tell me their stories. I mean, get down to business and tell me what you need and put the question in there. I get these long, lengthy emails that don't even have a question in them, with very bad punctuation and grammar, and they're very difficult to understand sometimes. So make it short, sweet, concise. I'll be glad to answer them. If you make it difficult for me, then I'm going to hit the delete button. So that's all for now.